Hello folks, this is Mr. O'Brien, and in this video I'm going to be going over Dr. King's Nonviolence, the Only Road to Freedom. Alright, so for this one I'm going to read the head note and just go over the few questions. Alright, so please turn to the head note in your packet. So by the time King wrote this spirited defense of nonviolence, the method's popularity was falling fast among African Americans, especially those younger and northern. All right, so we're beginning the kind of the northern phase of the civil rights movement, and as we've learned, redlining is much tougher to combat than Eugene Bull Connor. All right, it's less visible. All right, and African Americans, especially those up north, were becoming increasingly frustrated with the lack of progress in the north. Right. So this essay is from 1966. All right. Whoa. Only 2 years before King was assassinated. All right, so second sentence. In light of deadly racist violence against nonviolent workers in the South and tremendous urban riots of the mid-60s, so from up 65 to 68, there were dozens and dozens of riots in urban areas, kind of this outburst of rage at the effects of redlining. Nonviolence seemed outdated and came under unprecedented questioning, even in civil rights circles. So many African Americans were getting angry at the slow progress, frustrated. In fact, the movement had never unanimously embraced King's commitment to nonviolence as an inviolable principle, meaning a principle you couldn't violate. Many activists were willing to use peaceful protest only as a tactical tool that could be dropped if it became ineffective. Stokely Carmichael, for example, was willing to use peaceful protest only as a tactical tool that could be dropped if it became ineffective. I just read the same line 2 times in a row. Stokely Carmichael, who became the head of SNCC, and his comrades made national headlines in 1966 by adopting the charged slogan, quote, Black Power, to describe the goals of the Black movement. So the mid-60s is when you begin to hear that phrase, Black Power. Fundamentally, this phrase conveyed African Americans' determination to run their freedom struggle independently of whites, as well as Black people's right and need to defend themselves against violence. Next paragraph, responding to mounting criticisms of his and his SCLC's tactics, King increasingly had to defend the wisdom and efficacy of nonviolence within the civil rights movement. In this magazine article, which is the essay we're reading here, King points to the dramatic gains of recent years, such as the Civil Rights Act of 64, the Voting Rights Act of 65, which resulted from nonviolent movements. He then proceeded to give his trademark critique of violence as an instrument of constructive social change, which is what we're interested in. While energetically defending nonviolence, the essay also shows King's growing accommodation to the rising appeal of Black nationalist ideas. He did not question every individual's right to defend oneself against assault. Rather, he asked people voluntarily to set aside that right to participate in a public demonstration for the purpose of publicizing and eradicating the social evil. King also endorsed Black Power's stress on African Americans organizing themselves to develop and wield independent power. He further acknowledged that using power and not relying solely on moral appeal would be necessary to compel a satisfactory white response to Black demands for social justice. Important shifts in King's program are also apparent, particularly increased on urban slum conditions, northern concerns, and economic issues rather than just on civil rights. So Dr. King is beginning to move his focus from Southern Jim Crow to more poverty-related and slum-related issues. After Malcolm X's violent death in February of 65 and amidst urban riots the following year, increasing numbers of Black youth rejected Martin Luther King Jr.'s nonviolent methods and sought a more militant approach to combating white supremacy in America, with the resulting riots in several northern and southern cities. The cry of Black Power, instead of We Shall Overcome and Freedom Now, became the slogan of a new faction of the civil rights movement. In response to Black Power advocates, King wrote an article for Ebony magazine that directly addressed the claims of this new movement and explained why he believed nonviolent protests still remained the most prudent means of advancing the cause of Black Americans. At this time, 1 year after Malcolm X's assassination, King echoed Malcolm about the need to move beyond demanding only Blacks' constitutional rights to more broadly seeking people's full human rights, including economic rights. So this essay was written a year after Malcolm X was assassinated, even though we have not yet gotten to that part in this packet. We are going to hear from Malcolm again. All right, so to go over the questions, the first question, why does King raise the issue of violent resistance in 1966? It's becoming widespread. That's pretty much the answer. Where is it in the essay? Indeed, there in the second paragraph, there was much talk of violence. It was the same talk we have heard for the past 10 years. It was the talk of fearful men saying that they would not join the nonviolent movement because they would not remain nonviolent if attacked. Now the climate had shifted so that it was even more popular to talk of violence. So there it is. It's becoming more widespread. All right, let's go down to the second question. What does King mean when he says that the threat of violence as a strategy for civil rights or economic improvement is non-existent? All right, he says a couple of things. I'm going to talk about the answers and go show you where it is in the text. He says those who argue for violence have not themselves taken part in any of the riots. So they're kind of being hypocritical. Then he also says that this is more of a reaction, not an action. It isn't a strategy. It's more of a reaction. All right, now let's the text that would be. All right, if you look at the paragraph that begins, I have talked. Okay, I have talked with many persons in the ghettos of the North who argue eloquently for the use of violence, but I observed none of them in the mobs that rioted in Chicago. I have heard the street corner preachers in Harlem and in Chicago's Washington Park, but in spite of the bitterness preached and the hatred espoused, none of them has ever been able to start a riot. So far, only the police, through their fears and prejudice, have goaded our people to riot. And once the riot starts, only the police or the National Guard have been able to put an end to them. This demonstrates that their violent eruptions are unplanned, uncontrollable temper tantrums brought on by the long-neglected poverty, humility, oppression, and exploitation. So violence, King says, as a strategy for social change in America is non-existent. All the sound and fury seems but the posturing of cowards whose bold talk produces no action and signifies nothing. All right, so there you have it. All right, those who are espousing retaliatory violence seem to not take part in any of the riots. And he goes on to say it's not really a strategy, it's more of a reaction. All right, next question. What practical reason does King mention to show that advocating violence on behalf of rights for Blacks in America is not smart? There's a couple of things. Number one, he says that violence will result in the deaths of many African Americans. Okay. Number two, he says that if African Americans ever showed any success in their retaliatory violence, they would be wiped out by the white population. Okay. Now let's see in the text where that's located. Paragraph that begins, I am convinced. I am convinced that for practical as well as moral reasons, nonviolence offers the only road to freedom for my people. In violent warfare, one must be prepared to face ruthlessly the fact that there will be casualties by the thousands, and there you have that. Anyone leading a violent conflict must be willing to make a sacrifice, many casualties to a minority population, confronting a well-armed, wealthy majority that is capable of exterminating the entire Black population and which would not hesitate if the survival of the white Western materialism were at stake. So that's both of them. Thousands of African Americans would die, and if they did achieve any success or show signs of beginning some success, they'd be wiped out by the white population, by the capital W West. All right, next question. Why does King believe that it is amusing when a Negro man talks of self-defense? All right. Now it begins right after the question of self-defense section. There are many people who very honestly raise the question of self-defense. This must be placed in perspective. It goes without saying that people will protect their homes. This is a right guaranteed by the Constitution. So it's important to realize, folks, that Dr. King does not say you should not defend yourself. His argument is when you are in the streets protesting for a positive social change, that is when you should not fight back. But if someone comes to your home and attacks you, you defend yourself. Let's move on. But the mere protection of one's home and person against assault by lawless night riders does not provide any positive approach to the fears and conditions which produce violence. In a nonviolent demonstration, self-defense must be approached from quite another perspective. One must remember that the cause of the demonstration is some exploitation or form of oppression that has made it necessary for men to demonstrate against evil. And here we have it. It is always amusing to me when a Negro man says that he can't demonstrate with us because if someone hit him, he would fight back. Here is a man whose children are being plagued by rats and roaches, whose wife is robbed daily at overpriced ghetto food stores, who himself is working for about 2/3 of the pay of a white person, doing a similar job and with similar skills. In spite of all this daily suffering, it takes someone spitting on him and calling him an N to make him want to fight. So there he has it. All right, you're being attacked every day is what King is saying. Why wait until you are literally spit in the face to fight back? He's saying his way lets you fight back every day. Let's move on. Conditions are such for Negroes in America that all Negroes ought to be fighting aggressively. It is as ridiculous for a Negro to raise the question of self-defense in retaliation to nonviolence as it is for a soldier on the battlefield to say his is not going to take any risks, or it should be he is not going to take any risks. He is there because he believes that the freedom of his country is worth the risk of his life. The same is true of the nonviolent demonstrator. He sees the misery of his people so clearly that he volunteers to suffer in their behalf and put an end to their plight. Okay? So that's that question. All right. In other words, self-defense should be happening every day, and the nonviolent methods will enable you to do that. The person engaging in nonviolent direct action is choosing to sacrifice him or herself for the greater good. Next question. Why does King believe that a focus on self-defense to promote progress for blacks is unproductive? All right. So he says a few things. All right, he says, number one, it's tough to maintain the distinction between retaliatory and aggressive action. You know, if there's some violent event between, say, police and African Americans, and it's on the news, who's the news going to blame? Who are people watching it going to blame? It's not going to be the police, all right, most of the time. He also argued that it will cause civil rights activists to lose sight of the real cause. In other words, they're going to be too busy arguing that they didn't start it and lose sight of why they were protesting in the first place. And he also goes on to say that only nonviolence will create the society in which we want to live. I've got to sneeze. Thank you. All right, so let's go to the text where that's located. All right. So if you look above where it says strategy for change, the paragraph that begins furthermore, it is extremely dangerous to organize a movement around self-defense. The line between defensive violence and aggressive or retaliatory violence is a fine line indeed. All right, when violence is tolerated, even as a means of self-defense, there is a grave danger that in the fervor of emotion, the main fight will be lost over the question of self-defense. So that's two answers right there that we already said. Only a refusal to hate or kill can put an end to the chain of violence in the world. And that's the third answer I talked about. and lead us toward a community where men can live together without fear. All right, last question. Actually, isn't the last question. According to King, what end goal of his civil rights movement forces him to resist violence? All right, there's a couple of end goals here. I just want you to jot these down. To create a better society, because he already said that. Only the opposite of hate will create this better society. In other words, remember his long arc of history argument that we should be moving towards greater freedom and greater justice, and hate will not bring us there. He also argues that the idea of the movement is not to make enemies. The idea is to get in, not to overthrow. The oppressor should not become the oppressed. So let's see where, the oppressed should not become the oppressor. Okay, so strategy for change, that section. The American racial revolution has been a revolution to get in rather than to overthrow. We want to share in the American economy, the housing market, the educational system, and the social opportunities. The goal itself indicates that a social change in America must be nonviolent. There you have it. Okay, now we get to the last question. And I don't need to go to the text for this one. It's pretty simple. What constitutional considerations does King argue on behalf of nonviolence? He also says that it's 100% certain, 100% clear that if they remain nonviolent, the Supreme Court is on their side. But if they become violent, even retaliatory violence, that's not so certain any longer. Okay, so there you have it. That's the end.